The evening sun cast long shadows across the marina as David Jackson stepped onto the polished deck of the Meridian, his weathered leather shoes making no sound against the teak planking. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to move through the world without announcing his presence, a skill honed through decades of being underestimated. He dressed carefully for tonight, choosing a simple navy blazer over dark jeans, the kind of understated elegance that whispered rather than shouted. His invitation, embossed on cream cardstock, wore the logo of Coastal Dynamics, the maritime logistics empire he'd built from nothing more than a borrowed truck and unshakable determination 15 years ago. The party was already in full swing. Crystalline laughter mingled with the gentle clink of champagne flutes, while string quartet music drifted across the water. David had been to dozens of these events, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he was here not as the CEO greeting clients, but as an anonymous guest, wanting to observe his company's culture when they thought no one important was watching. He'd specifically requested that the event coordinator not announce his attendance. "I want to see how our people really treat clients when there's no pressure to perform," he'd told his assistant. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly assumptions would form about a black man in casual dress boarding a yacht full of predominantly white executives and their guests. As he moved through the crowd, David noticed the subtle choreography of avoidance. Conversations paused mid-sentence as he passed, only to resume in hushed tones behind him. A waiter approached with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, then seemed to reconsider, veering toward a group of women in cocktail dresses instead. David had felt this particular rhythm before, the social dance of inclusion and exclusion, performed with such practiced subtlety that calling it out would seem paranoid. He accepted it with the weary grace of someone who had learned to pick his battles carefully. Near the bow of the yacht, he paused to admire the harbor view, the city lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled over the water. The invitation had promised an exclusive evening celebrating Coastal Dynamics' record-breaking quarter, and David felt a quiet pride watching his employees and clients enjoy the fruits of collective labor. That's when he first noticed her. Cassandra Morrison moved through the party like she owned not just the event, but the very air around it. Tall and striking in an emerald silk dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, she carried herself with the particular brand of authority that came from never having that authority questioned. As the senior event coordinator for Harborview Hospitality, the company Coastal Dynamics contracted for their major events, she was technically David's employee tonight, though neither of them knew it yet. David watched as she glided between groups, her smile wide and practiced, touching arms and laughing at jokes with the effortless charm of someone accustomed to managing wealthy clients' expectations. She commanded respect through presence alone, and David found himself curious about whether that respect would extend to someone she perceived as beneath her station. He wouldn't have to wait long to find out. If you are enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means a lot to us. We are just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you. And back to the video. Cassandra had noticed a man in the navy blazer almost immediately when he'd boarded. In her 5 years of managing high-end events, she developed an instinct for reading people, their clothes, their posture, their confidence level. It was essential for ensuring the right people got the right treatment, and tonight's guest list included some of the most influential figures in maritime commerce. The man near the bow didn't quite fit the pattern. His clothes were nice enough, certainly, but they lacked the particular sheen of true wealth. More concerning was the way other guests seemed to create subtle distance around him. Cassandra prided herself on maintaining the exclusive atmosphere that made these events special, and part of that meant ensuring everyone present truly belonged. She'd seen it before, plus ones who weren't properly briefed on the dress code, or staff members who tried to blend in with the guests. Usually a quiet word was enough to resolve the situation without embarrassment on either side. Smoothing her dress, Cassandra approached with her most diplomatic smile. The man was standing alone now, looking out over the water with an expression of quiet contemplation that might have been mistaken for melancholy by someone less perceptive than herself. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the warm authority of a skilled hostess. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Cassandra Morrison, coordinating tonight's event." David turned, and she was struck by the directness of his gaze. His eyes held an intelligence that made her reassess her initial assumptions, though not enough to change her approach entirely. "David Jackson," he replied, extending his hand with a slight smile. His handshake was firm, confident, the grip of someone accustomed to business dealings. "Wonderful to meet you, David. I hope you're enjoying the evening." Cassandra maintained her professional warmth while mentally cataloging details. The name didn't immediately ring familiar, though she'd memorized the VIP list weeks ago. "I'm just making my rounds, ensuring everyone has everything they need. Are you here with someone tonight?" It was a diplomatic way of asking how he'd gotten aboard, and David recognized the question beneath the question. He'd been asked variations of it his entire career, in boardrooms, at industry conferences, at charity galas. Always politely, always with a smile, always with the underlying assumption that his presence required explanation. "I received an invitation," David said simply, pulling the embossed card from his jacket pocket. Cassandra glanced at it, her expression unchanging. "Of course. Though I have to say, I don't recall your name from our confirmed guest list. Perhaps there was a miscommunication with your company." The suggestion hung in the air like expensive perfume, beautiful on the surface, but with an underlying chemical sharpness. David felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the old anger that he'd learned to compress into something smaller and more manageable. "I'm sure it's there," he said quietly. "Perhaps under coastal dynamics?" "Coastal dynamics," Cassandra repeated, her brow furrowing slightly. "Yes, of course, they're our hosts tonight. Are you one of their vendors?" The question landed with surgical precision. Not a partner, not a client, not an executive, a vendor. Someone who provided services to the real power brokers, who might merit an invitation as a courtesy, but wouldn't be expected to mingle as an equal. David felt something shift inside him, a decision crystallizing. He could correct her assumption now, could produce his business card or call his assistant to verify his identity. Instead, he found himself curious to see how far this would go. "Something like that," he said. Word traveled quickly through the social ecosystem of the yacht. Cassandra's subtle inquiries about the vendor, who seemed to be out of place, created ripples of awareness among the other guests. Soon, David found himself the subject of sidelong glances and whispered speculation. Margaret Chun, a shipping executive from Seattle, leaned toward her colleague with barely concealed curiosity. "Did you hear? Apparently someone crashed the party. Cassandra's handling it, but you can tell she's not happy." "What kind of person tries to sneak onto a corporate yacht party?" replied James Rodriguez, a logistics consultant who'd been hoping to network with Coastal Dynamics leadership. "The security must be tighter than I thought if they caught him so quickly." David overheard fragments of these conversations as he moved through the crowd, each assumption building on the last until a complete narrative had emerged. He was an interloper, possibly with malicious intent, certainly without legitimate reason to be there. The fact that he appeared calm and well-dressed only made him more suspicious in their eyes, a better class of party crasher, perhaps, but crasher nonetheless. The whispers followed him to the bar, where the bartender, a young man named Marcus who wore his discomfort openly, served him with obvious reluctance. "What can I get you, sir?" Marcus asked, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining professionalism, while clearly wishing David would disappear. "Whiskey neat. Whatever you recommend." Marcus poured a generous measure of top-shelf bourbon, his hands slightly unsteady. As he slid the glass across the bar, he leaned in conspiratorially. "Look, man, I don't know your situation, but if you're trying to make connections or whatever, this probably isn't the way. These people, they notice everything. And Cassandra, she's got serious influence. It might be better to just finish your drink and quietly head out before this becomes a bigger thing." David looked at the young bartender, probably 25, definitely trying to be helpful in his own way, and felt a stab of recognition. How many times had he been in Marcus's position, wanting to warn someone about social dangers they might not see coming? "I appreciate the advice," David said, raising his glass in a small toast. "But I think I'll stick around a while longer." From across the deck, Cassandra watched the interaction with growing concern. The man's refusal to take hints was becoming a problem. She'd given him multiple opportunities to gracefully exit, but he seemed determined to force a confrontation. In her experience, people who pushed boundaries this persistently usually had ulterior motives. She approached Richard Blackwood, the senior vice president she knew best from Coastal Dynamics' corporate hierarchy. Richard was a man in his 60s who'd built his career on reading people and situations quickly. Exactly the kind of ally she needed in this delicate situation. "Richard," she said, sliding up beside him with practiced ease, "I wonder if you could help me with something. We seem to have a situation developing." Richard followed her gaze to David, who was now engaged in quiet conversation with Dr. Sarah Kim, a marine biologist who consulted for several shipping companies. Even from a distance, it was clear that Sarah was finding the conversation engaging. She was laughing and gesturing animatedly in a way that suggested genuine interest. "The gentleman in the navy jacket," Cassandra continued. "He claims to have an invitation, but his name isn't on any of our confirmed lists. I'm trying to handle this diplomatically, but he's becoming increasingly resistant to redirection." Richard studied David with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about people. What he saw was troubling. A man who didn't quite fit the expected profile of their guest list, engaging with legitimate attendees in a way that suggested familiarity with their world. "Have you checked with security?" Richard asked. "I was hoping to avoid making a scene, but if he continues to resist." Cassandra let the implication hang in the air. Richard nodded grimly. Corporate events like this one were about more than just celebration. They were about maintaining carefully constructed networks of power and influence. Someone who didn't belong, who refused to acknowledge they didn't belong, represented a threat to that delicate ecosystem. "Do what you need to do," he said. "I'll back you up if it becomes necessary." Armed with Richard's implicit support, Cassandra returned to David with renewed authority. This time, she wasn't alone. She'd subtly gathered a small audience of concerned guests who'd positioned themselves within earshot, ostensibly engaged in their own conversations, but clearly monitoring the situation. David was still talking with Dr. Kim when Cassandra approached, their conversation having evolved into a detailed discussion about sustainable shipping practices and their environmental impact. Sarah was clearly impressed by David's knowledge of maritime regulations and industry trends. "Mr. Jackson," Cassandra interrupted with a smile that had lost several degrees of warmth, "I wonder if I could speak with you privately for a moment?" Sarah looked between them, sensing the tension but uncertain of its source. "Oh, I'm sorry. Am I interrupting something important?" "Not all, Dr. Kim," Cassandra replied smoothly. "I just need to clarify a small administrative matter with Mr. Jackson here." David excused himself and followed Cassandra to a relatively quiet corner of the deck, though he noticed that their movement had attracted even more attention. Phones were emerging from purses and pockets, not obviously pointed in their direction, but positioned for quick deployment if something worth recording should occur. "Mr. Jackson," Cassandra began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having difficult conversations, "I've been trying to be discreet about this, but I'm afraid we have a problem. I've double-checked our guest lists, our vendor lists, and our staff rosters, and your name simply doesn't appear anywhere." She paused, allowing the implication to settle. Around them, the party continued, but David could feel the weight of observation from multiple directions. "Now, I understand that sometimes there are misunderstandings," Cassandra continued. "Perhaps you received an invitation intended for someone else, or maybe there was a miscommunication about the dress code or the nature of the event. But the fact remains that you don't appear to have legitimate credentials to be here." David felt the moment crystallizing around him, like water freezing into ice. This was the decision point, the moment where he could reveal his identity and end this farce, or continue to see how deep the assumptions ran. "I have my invitation," he said calmly, though something in his voice had changed. The conciliatory tone was gone. replaced by something harder and more focused. "Yes, you've shown me a piece of paper," Cassandra replied, her own voice rising slightly. "But invitation fraud isn't uncommon at events like this. People photocopy invitations, or they find them online, or they get them from someone else who can't attend. What I need is verification of your legitimate connection to Coastal Dynamics or one of their approved partners." The word fraud landed like a physical blow. David felt his jaw tighten involuntarily, his hands forming fists before he consciously relaxed them. Around him, the eavesdropping had become less subtle. Conversations were dying out as people turned to watch the drama unfold. "What exactly are you suggesting?" David asked. Cassandra took a breath, committing fully to her course of action. "I'm suggesting that you may not have legitimate business being here. And if that's the case, then for the safety and comfort of our actual guests, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words hung in the air like a challenge. David looked around at the faces watching him, some curious, some uncomfortable, some openly hostile. These were people who made decisions about millions of dollars in shipping contracts, who controlled supply chains that affected global commerce, who prided themselves on their ability to read situations and people correctly. And every single one of them had already decided who he was and what he represented. "And if I refuse?" David asked quietly. Cassandra's smile became sharp-edged. "Then we'll have security escort you off. I really hope it doesn't come to that, for everyone's sake." The threat of security created a palpable shift in the atmosphere aboard the Meridian. What had begun as subtle social maneuvering was now approaching open confrontation, and the guests found themselves unwilling spectators to a drama that was quickly spiraling beyond anyone's control. Marcus, the bartender, watched from behind his station with growing anxiety. He'd seen enough corporate events to know when things were about to go very wrong, and this situation had all the hallmarks of a career-ending disaster for everyone involved. He found himself hoping that David would just leave quietly, if only to spare everyone the embarrassment of what was coming. Dr. Sarah Kim, meanwhile, was struggling with her own conflicted feelings. Her conversation with David had revealed someone with impressive depth of knowledge about her field, not the superficial understanding of a party crasher trying to blend in, but the comprehensive grasp of someone who'd been making decisions in the maritime industry for years. Yet Cassandra's concerns seemed legitimate too. How could both things be true? Richard Blackwood positioned himself strategically near the confrontation, ready to intervene if David became aggressive or disruptive. In his decades of corporate experience, he learned that situations like this could escalate quickly, especially when someone felt cornered. The best approach was to project strength while offering face-saving alternatives. "Mr. Jackson," Richard interjected with practiced diplomatic authority, "I think what Cassandra is trying to say is that we want to make sure everyone here tonight feels comfortable and safe. These events are invitation only for a reason, and we have to maintain certain standards." He paused, giving David an appraising look that was meant to communicate both sympathy and firmness. "Now, if there's been some kind of misunderstanding about your invitation, we can certainly help sort that out. But the appropriate place to do that would be through proper channels, not by remaining at the event while we investigate. I'm sure you can understand our position." David looked at Richard, really looked at him, and saw something familiar in the older man's eyes. It was the same look he'd gotten from countless executives over the years, the expression of someone who genuinely believed they were being reasonable and fair while systematically excluding people who didn't fit their predetermined categories. "I understand your position perfectly," David said, his voice carrying a weight that made several nearby guests shift uncomfortably. "The question is whether you understand mine." Before anyone could respond, Cassandra stepped forward with renewed determination. "Mr. Jackson, I'm going to count to 3. If you haven't started moving toward the gangway by then, I'm calling security." 1. The countdown created a moment of surreal theater. Conversations throughout the yacht died as guests turned to witness what was happening. Phones were now openly recording, social media posts already being composed in anticipation of whatever drama was about to unfold. 2. David stood perfectly still, his eyes moving slowly across the crowd of faces watching him. He saw curiosity, discomfort, anticipation, and judgment, but nowhere did he see recognition of the fundamental injustice playing out before them. These were people who prided themselves on their fairness and professionalism, yet none of them had questioned the assumptions driving this confrontation. 3. Cassandra reached for her phone, her fingers already swiping to the security contact. But before she could complete the call, David spoke. "Before you do that," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet deck, "I have a question for you." David's words created a pause that seemed to stretch across the water itself. Even the waves appeared to quiet as everyone aboard the Meridian waited to hear what he would say next. Cassandra's finger hovered over her phone screen, caught between momentum and sudden uncertainty. "What question?" she asked, though something in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know the answer. David looked around at the assembled guests, executives, consultants, academics, and socialites who represented the elite of the maritime industry. These were people who made decisions affecting thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in commerce. They were intelligent, educated, successful individuals who would vehemently deny any prejudice, while unconsciously perpetuating the very systems they claimed to oppose. "My question," David said, his voice carrying with unusual clarity, "is this: what makes you so certain I don't belong here?" The question landed with unexpected force. It was simple, direct, and impossible to answer without revealing the assumptions that had driven the entire confrontation. Cassandra felt her certainty waver for the first time all evening. You don't have proper credentials," she said, though the words sounded weaker now than they had moments before. "I showed you my invitation," David replied calmly. "You decided it wasn't legitimate. Based on what evidence?" "Your name wasn't on the guest list," Richard interjected, trying to support Cassandra's position. "Did you check every list?" David asked. "Corporate executives, board members, major shareholders? Did you look at the list of people who wouldn't need their names on a standard guest roster because their presence would be automatically approved?" The questions created ripples of unease throughout the crowd. Several guests exchanged glances, beginning to sense that they might be witnessing something more complex than a simple party crasher being removed. Dr. Sarah Kim stepped forward, her scientific training driving her toward evidence-based conclusions. I have to say, his knowledge of maritime environmental regulations was extremely detailed. We discussed policy changes that haven't even been publicly announced yet. "Anyone can research talking points online," Cassandra said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Not these ones," Sarah replied firmly. "What we discussed came from internal regulatory meetings that aren't public record. Either he has extremely high-level industry connections, or—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like morning fog rolling off the harbor. David watched the doubt creep across faces throughout the crowd. He could end this now with a simple revelation, but something made him push further. These people needed to understand not just that they'd made an error, but why they'd made it so confidently and with so little evidence. "Let me ask you another question," David continued, his gaze moving slowly across the assembled guests. "If I were a 60-year-old white man in khakis and a polo shirt, would you have questioned my invitation so quickly? Would you have demanded additional verification? Would you have threatened to call security?" The question created an uncomfortable silence that stretched across the deck like shadows at sunset. Several guests looked away, while others shifted uncomfortably. It was Margaret Chun who finally broke the silence. "That's not fair," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "This isn't about race. It's about security protocols." "Is it?" David asked gently. "Then why didn't anyone ask to see Richard's credentials when he positioned himself as my judge and jury? Why didn't anyone question Cassandra's authority to determine who belongs at an event she didn't organize for a company she doesn't work for?" Richard felt his face flush as the implications of David's words settled over him. Around them, the crowd was beginning to murmur, conversation starting and stopping as people grappled with questions they hadn't wanted to consider. You're trying to make this about something it's not, Cassandra said, but even she could hear the defensiveness in her voice. Am I? David reached into his jacket pocket, and for a moment everyone tensed, unsure what he might produce. What emerged was a simple black leather wallet, expensive but understated. From it, he withdrew a single business card. Before you call security, he said, extending the card toward Cassandra. You might want to know who you're having removed from the event. Cassandra took the business card with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the embossed text as the color slowly drained from her face. The card was elegant in its simplicity. David Jackson, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Coastal Dynamics Maritime Solutions. Around her, the crowd pressed closer, trying to read over her shoulder. Margaret Chin was the first to gasp audibly as the implications hit her like a physical blow. James Rodriguez actually stumbled backward, nearly colliding with another guest as he processed what he was seeing. That's not possible, Cassandra whispered, though her voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. David watched her struggle with the cognitive dissonance, the fundamental disconnection between what she'd assumed about him and what she was now being forced to confront. Around them, phones were being raised as guests began to document what was clearly about to become a legendary moment in corporate event history. Would you like to verify it? David asked quietly. I can give you the direct number from my assistant, or you could call the main office and ask to be transferred to my line. But even as he spoke, recognition was dawning on faces throughout the crowd. Richard Blackwood's expression had gone from authoritative to stricken as he realized he'd just threatened to have his own company CEO removed from a party celebrating their record-breaking quarter. Dr. Sarah Kim shook her head with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The environmental regulations we discussed, you weren't just knowledgeable about them. You helped create them. Those internal meetings you referenced, you were in those meetings. Some of them, David confirmed with a slight smile that held no warmth whatsoever. Marcus, still watching from behind the bar, felt his stomach drop as he remembered his well-intentioned advice about avoiding confrontation with these people. The irony was almost too painful to contemplate, but it was Cassandra who was experiencing the full weight of the revelation. As the senior event coordinator for Harborview Hospitality, she was technically David's employee for this event. The man she'd threatened to have ejected was not only the guest of honor, but effectively her boss for the evening. Mr. Jackson, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you just tell me who you were? David looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of similar experiences. Because I wanted to see what would happen if you thought I was nobody important. I wanted to understand how my employees treat people they don't think matter. I wanted to know what kind of culture exists in my company when people think the boss isn't watching. The words hit the assembled crowd like a cold wave. These weren't just personal accusations. They were professional judgments from someone with the power to affect careers and contracts. The guests began to realize that everything they'd said, every assumption they'd made, every moment they'd remained silent during the confrontation, had been observed and noted by the person who ultimately controlled many of their business relationships. This isn't who we are, Richard said desperately, though the words sounded hollow even to himself. Isn't it? David asked. Because from where I stand, this is exactly who you are when you think it doesn't matter. This is how you treat people you perceive as having no power and no importance, no ability to affect your lives or careers. He gestured toward the crowd of guests, many of whom were now avoiding eye contact entirely. Every single one of you watched this happen. Some of you actively participated. Others just stood by and recorded it for social media. But not one person, not one, stepped forward to question whether this treatment was appropriate or just. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a warning flare. David wasn't just calling out Cassandra's behavior. He was indicting the entire social system that had allowed it to happen. In the aftermath of David's revelation, the Meridian had become a floating court of accountability. The festive atmosphere had evaporated entirely, replaced by the uncomfortable silence of people being forced to confront their own complicity in systemic injustice. David walked slowly through the crowd, his presence now commanding a respect that should have existed from the moment he'd stepped aboard. Guests who had been eager to avoid him earlier now desperately hoped to catch his eye, to somehow communicate their belated recognition of his authority and importance. But David wasn't interested in their sudden deference. His focus remained on the broader implications of what had just occurred. "I started this company 15 years ago," he said, his voice carrying across the deck without amplification. "I started it because I believed the maritime industry could be better, more efficient, more sustainable, more equitable. I believed we could build something that valued people for their contributions rather than their appearances or backgrounds." He paused near the spot where Cassandra still stood, her face a portrait of professional devastation. "Tonight has shown me that I failed in that mission. Not in building a successful business. Our financial results speak for themselves, but in building the kind of culture I thought I was creating." Several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that their behavior was being held up as evidence of that cultural failure. Dr. Sarah Kim found her voice first. "Mr. Jackson, I think it's important to note that not everyone here participated in what happened. Some of us were genuinely engaged in conversation with you, treating you as an equal before we knew your position." David nodded acknowledgement. "You're right, Dr. Kim, and I appreciate that. But even those who treated me respectfully did so because they found me interesting or knowledgeable, not because basic human dignity should be unconditional. The question isn't whether some people here behaved better than others. It's why anyone thought this behavior was acceptable in the first place." Richard Blackwood, still struggling with the implications of his own involvement, stepped forward. "David, Mr. Jackson, I think we need to acknowledge that what happened tonight was an aberration. Cassandra was doing what she thought was her job, protecting the integrity of the event." "Was she?" David asked. "Or was she doing what felt natural and right to her, policing the boundaries of who belongs in spaces like this? And were you supporting her because you agreed with her judgment, or because you automatically trusted her assessment of the situation?" The questions were surgical in their precision, cutting directly to the heart of unconscious bias and systemic exclusion. Richard found himself unable to formulate a defense that didn't reveal the very prejudices David was highlighting. Cassandra finally spoke, her professional composure cracking under the weight of her realization. "I thought I was protecting the event. I thought I was doing my job professionally and appropriately." "I believe you," David said, and his tone held more sadness than anger. "That's exactly the problem. You genuinely thought you were being professional. You saw nothing wrong with your assumptions, your demands for additional verification, your threats to have me removed. It all felt natural and appropriate to you." He looked around at the assembled guests, many of whom were now documenting the conversation on their phones, though whether for accountability or entertainment remained unclear. "How many of you have been in meetings where the only black person in the room was assumed to be taking notes rather than running the meeting? How many times have you watched someone have their authority questioned in ways that wouldn't happen to someone who looked different? How many times have you seen it and said nothing because it felt normal?" The questions created ripples of uncomfortable recognition throughout the crowd. These were successful, educated people who considered themselves progressive and fair-minded, yet David's words were forcing them to confront patterns of behavior they'd never consciously acknowledged. Margaretchen spoke up, her voice subdued. "I think what you're asking us to consider is that we all participated in this, even those of us who didn't actively contribute to the confrontation." "Exactly," David replied. "Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Assumption without evidence is prejudice. Comfort with exclusion is privilege." As the evening progressed and David's words settled over the gathered guests like a heavy blanket, the party faced an unusual decision point. They could attempt to return to celebration, pretending the confrontation had never happened, or they could use this moment as an opportunity for genuine reflection and change. David made the choice for them. "I'm going to leave now," he announced. "Not because I don't belong here. I think we've established that I do. but because I need to think about what tonight means for my company and for the partnerships we've built. The implication was clear. Consequences would follow. Contracts might be reconsidered, relationships might be reevaluated, and the behavior displayed tonight would factor into future business decisions. Cassandra stepped forward desperately. "Mr. Jackson, please. I know I made a terrible mistake. I know I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, but I hope you won't judge everyone here by my failures." David looked at her with something that might have been compassion. "Cassandra, your mistake wasn't in making assumptions. We all make assumptions. Your mistake was in acting on those assumptions without evidence, and in refusing to reconsider when presented with information that contradicted your preconceptions." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "But you're not the only one who failed tonight. Everyone who watched this happen and said nothing. Everyone who assumed you must be right because your confidence never wavered. Everyone who was more interested in recording the drama than preventing the injustice. They all participated in what happened here." Richard stepped forward one final time. "What can we do to make this right?" David smiled, but it was a tired smile that held little warmth. "You can start by asking yourselves why you needed me to be important before my treatment mattered to you. You can examine why basic human dignity felt conditional on my credentials. And you can consider what other assumptions you make every day that go unchallenged because the people affected don't have the power to call you to account." He began walking toward the gangway, then stopped and turned back to the silent crowd. "I built this company because I believed we could do better. Tonight has shown me that building a successful business isn't the same as building an equitable one. That's something I'll have to consider carefully going forward." As David walked away from the Meridian, his footsteps echoing on the wooden dock, the guests were left to contemplate the evening's events and their own roles in what had transpired. The party continued in muted fashion, but the celebration had been fundamentally altered by the confrontation and its aftermath. In the days following the yacht incident, the maritime industry buzzed with news of what had happened aboard the Meridian. Social media posts from attendees had created a narrative that spread far beyond the original guest list, sparking conversations about bias, assumption, and accountability in corporate settings. David returned to his office on Monday morning to find his assistant fielding calls from journalists, industry colleagues, and corporate partners, all seeking his perspective on the incident. He'd spent the weekend reflecting on the evening's events and what they meant for his company's future direction. Cassandra Morrison submitted her resignation to Harborview Hospitality within 48 hours of the party, recognizing that her professional reputation had been irreparably damaged by her handling of the situation. In her resignation letter, she wrote, "I failed to recognize that my assumptions about who belongs in professional spaces were not just wrong, but actively harmful. I hope others can learn from our mistakes." Richard Blackwood requested a private meeting with David, hoping to salvage the business relationship between their companies. When they met in David's office, Richard began with what he clearly thought was an appropriate apology. "David, I want you to know that what happened Saturday night doesn't represent our company's values or our commitment to diversity and inclusion." David listened patiently, then responded, "Richard, I think it represents your values exactly. When you were faced with a situation where someone didn't fit your expectations, your immediate instinct was to support exclusion rather than inclusion. Your values were revealed by your actions, not contradicted by them." The conversation was difficult, but ultimately productive. Richard left with a commitment to implement bias training for his entire staff and to examine his company's practices around event management and client relations. Dr. Sarah Kim reached out to David with a proposal for a joint research initiative focusing on environmental justice in maritime commerce. "I was thinking about our conversation before everything else happened," she wrote in her email. "Your insights about regulatory frameworks weren't just impressive, they were necessary. I'd like to explore how we can build equity into environmental policy from the beginning."